Hello, welcome to this Lit 5 video on The Laughter of Stafford Girls High by Duffy. This video is to be watched in conjunction with the first video on contexts, please check that out, and the third video on close language analysis, please also check that out. This one sits in the middle and it looks at the use of form and structure in Duffy's brilliant poem. Hope you find it useful. If so, please add your likes, subscribe to the channel, and your comments underneath. Okay, 1 of 5 here on form. So form, as I'm sure you know, is what kind and type of poem it is. This particular poem is a mock epic. As you can see from the definition on screen there, a mock epic is a piece of writing which adopts the form of an epic poem for satirical reasons. So adopts the form of an epic poem. So it takes something trivial, every day, and elevates it into a style which is usually reserved for epic poetry. So you're looking at something like Homer's The Odyssey. Epic poetry usually involves gods, something on a cosmic scale, something on a heavenly, divine level. It's anything but the ordinary. So we've also got a mention there of satirical reasons. Now, if you're not sure of satire, if you might know the programme on television called Mock the Week. So at the heart of satire is mockery. Satirical writing has a target. It aims at things in order to mock them, usually important figures in society or society itself. Satirical writing is aimed at something. A famous example of a mock epic is there on screen for you, something called The Rape of the Lock by Alexander Pope, a poem in which a petty quarrel about a lock of hair is presented in cosmic and mythic style in order to point out just how petty, to mock, you see, satire, satirical mockery, how petty the argument was. If you want a slightly more up-to-date version, I strongly recommend, if you have the time, read Simon Armitage's brilliant poem Poundland. So I imagine you've been in Poundland at some stage in your life. Look at how he elevates that to something approaching, I don't know, typical of Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. There are epic sort of consequences, and it's elevated to the status of godliness or grim orcs who skulk around the stationery aisle. It's absolutely brilliant and very, very funny in my opinion. If you're brave/foolish, you could also read James Joyce's amazing novel Ulysses, but that's not for the faint-hearted. He takes the idea of the Trojan War with Odysseus, or Ulysses to give him his other name, and he puts that in the Dublin of his era. So lots of mock epics around. Now we have to be careful here, even though this is a mock epic poem, and there are satirical targets to mock epics and satirical writing, and as I've mentioned earlier, mock epics use the trivial or the everyday. Please don't think that what happens in this poem is being trivialised. So as we mentioned in the contexts video, the laughter in this poem, this would be your everyday instance or occurrence. This is not being trivialised. Yes, it's merely, if you like, some laughter spreading throughout a school in the events of the poem. However, that is not the thing to be trivialised. That remains important, vital, needed, necessary, wanted and very necessary chaos which destroys this institution. So I've put down the bottom there, is the use of mock epic as opposed to a straight-faced epic, belittling and trivialising the rise of feminism? Absolutely not in this poem. The target, the satirical mockery, is the school system. Duffy herself went to a convent school. She doesn't recall it with lots of affection. She's on record as saying that she had lots of lists inflicted on her, and that's what passed as education. So we see that reflected in the poem, of course. So no, the laughter, which is feminism, metaphorically, is not being trivialised. The thing being trivialised is the awful repressive education and the rules and the style of education that was inflicted upon Duffy and people of her generation. Moving on. Still on 1 of 5 here. I thought I'd quickly show you some ingredients or components which contribute to making this a mock epic. So we'll have a very quick look at some quotations here. Not on the level we do in the language video, please check that out, that's most important, but just to prove it's a mock epic if you like. In our first quotation here from the opening of the poem, it was the girl in the 3rd form, Caroline Clare. I deliberately emphasise that because I don't think it's an accident, okay? So the person who wrote this note, from which the chaotic and destructive consequences occur, just so happens to share the name of the poet who is also writing this poem. Maybe Caroline Duffy wants to take the credit and the glory for starting the destruction of this kind of institution, but more on that when I look at the ending and go the beginning and look straight at the ending on the last slide. So we have here, who passed a note which has never been found to the classmate in front. What we're getting here, and we see it in other examples as well, we're getting this kind of realism and authenticity to the story, to give it this sort of idea of historical weight and significance. So this is a watershed moment. This is something that history and historians should be writing history textbooks about. So adding that idea of the note has never been found sort of gives it that historical credibility. On this second quote as well, we have here, it was then that Mrs. Mackay made mistake number 1. So we've also got a retrospective quality to it as well. So the narrator, unnamed third-person omniscient narrator to this poem, is reflecting back on these events, almost like that historical focus, in the same way you might do causes of World War One, or what were the consequences of JF Kennedy being shot, etc., etc. We have this kind of mistake number 1. So we're looking back in retrospect here at this sort of seismic event which left its mark on history. Similarly to the first one where I mentioned no one can find the note, we have another example here of no one on record recalls the words that were said. So some things escape capture at this sort of seismic and life-changing moment in the history of this school. Moving round to our next quotation here again, with that idea of leaving its imprint on history. In years later, the size of the snowball rolled by the 6th grew like a legend. So in the language video we talk about the metaphorical nature of this snowball, but there's your stuff of myth and legend again. Used sort of paradoxically really to say that even though it might be the stuff of legend, it's trying to give a realism and an actual historical credibility to this story. Just on that as well, you have the school poet Ursula Flare. So mentions of flowers in our language video is also important as well. In her prose poem Snow, wrote that it took the rest of the Michaelmas term to melt. So again, another legendary aspect to this story. Also, we should consider as well that ice, snow, when it melts becomes water. Plenty on that in the language video. So there's some ingredients that sort of help it qualify or give it the sort of flavour of a mock epic poem. 2 of 5. I've added in a critical quote here from Peter Forbes, who wrote an article on the feminine gospels in The Guardian. You can look it up if you wish. Here he's identifying a pattern in many Duffy poems. I think he's referring to the poem Tall in the Feminine Gospels collection, but this is something very true of Caroline Duffy's poetry. He notes that the poems start with a simple idea. So if we're thinking in terms of our mock epic, someone wrote a note and someone laughed. There's your trivial everyday event, but from that the epic occurs, or something epic if you like. And she uses that simple idea and extrapolate it to extremes that tell us something about the times we live. I thought that was a really useful critical quote. Many of Duffy's poems start in the everyday, the ordinary, someone at home, someone can be making something or baking something, and then it elevates. It transcends to some kind of philosophical or contemporary insight, sometimes a critique of the modern world. Duffy is very, very influenced by Philip Larkin, and Larkin has a similar thing. So someone can be picking their nails, for example, in a Larkin poem that hasn't been written, and from the dirt that comes out under their nails, some kind of philosophical truth or insight or epiphany will occur. Okay, moving on. Okay, structure, there in big letters. Structure is something which tends to get students in knots or breaks them out into a cold sweat. I can see why. An entire essay can be written about a poem just on structure alone once you get some basic principles of structure. Examiners tend to like students having a bit of a foray into structure and analysing it, but you have to be careful not to neglect the language used in the poem as well. For me, I think structure can be used successfully if you boil it down to a few key principles. So, what do we mean by structure? Well, for me, and my approach to it, and what I recommend students do, is concern themselves with the following things. Order and sequence, the order in which the story or the poem or the novel or whichever text you're looking at is structured, the A followed by the B followed by the C. Second of all, and this takes a bit of practice, but this is possibly where students get in knots over structure, any patterns you can see. So in a way, structure can be as many things as you want it to be, because a different pair of eyes will see a pattern that no one else has considered compared to the patterns you see. But if you're foregrounding that in your essays as structurally the right and away you go. So we'll explore some patterns in a moment that I've at least seen. If you see other ones, feel free to contribute on the comments or use them in your own analysis. That would be marvellous. To help with that, I think it's also useful to look at shifts. Okay, and wording I strongly recommend if you're doing this kind of structural analysis is shifts from and moves to. Okay, so shifts cut across those ideas of order and sequence, and to some extent patterns as well. So hopefully that pinpoints what structure can be about. Different teachers will say different things, of course, but I find those very, very workable, and I'm going to illustrate those to you now, and hopefully you can use similar skills for structural analysis in future. Okay, a structural pattern I've noticed in this poem, and it happens quite often. These are just 2 examples. I think I counted them, maybe about 6 or 7, but happy to be corrected on that, are instances of juxtaposition. So a pattern of juxtaposition where you have teachers trying, ultimately failing, to control and scowl at pupils and force them into obedience and learning and what they would call good behaviour. Pretty soon, or maybe in spite of those attempts to control and repress them, more on that in the language video, you see outbursts of laughter. You possibly can recall yourself from your school days. Don't laugh! Stop laughing! Stop laughing! And of course, that instruction to stop laughing merely increases your laughter and your hilarity. I can recall several instances of that. So if we have a little look here, we have morning assembly, the world like quink outside, which is ink. The teachers perched in a solemn row on stage. Dr. Bream's serious affair. The hymn Jerusalem hung in their big chords. Yesterday, intoned Dr. Bream, the lower school behaved in a foolish way, sniggering for most of the late afternoon. More on the word sniggering when we look at Beano and playful language in the language video. She glared at the girls through her pince-nez, those little spectacles that perch on the end of your nose. however. But the first and second and third and fourth forms started to laugh, each girl trying to swallow it down till the sound was like distant thunder, the opening chord of a storm. There's plenty on that in the language video when we start looking at language, but we're looking at patterns here. So there you can see attempts to stifle and repress fails spectacularly. It has the adverse, it has the opposite effect. Another example, again we could do plenty on this, but we're looking at structure here. It's gone into detail more so in the language video. The empty corridor, distant piano, there's Senora Devises counting in Spanish. So there's your lessons and your learning taking place. Well, we say learning. This is obviously part of what Duffy is satirically mocking, and this kind of A to Z linear, boring approach to education. A shrill whistle blowing outside. So there's an important symbol of control. See the language video for more of those. Obviously in games or PE. ... But then a burst of hysteria came from the classroom above, rolled down the stairs, exploded again in the classroom below. There's the teacher's attempt to carry on teaching. There's a little humour with innuendo and playful language there upon the place beneath. ... Cackles like gunfire crackled and spat throughout the school. A cheer boomed. Interesting on language, you got a kind of incendiary, explosive language there, showing the destructive effects of this. More on that in the language video. However, there are two examples of a pattern I've noticed, attempts to control which cause or result in failure from the teacher's point of view, but freedom, release and liberation from the pupil's point of view. Okay, a structural feature here. So, for me, there's a key turning point in the poem, and it's round about stanza 11. From stanza 11 onwards, we move away for the first time from the events in the school. So the first 1 to 10 are to do with the outbreak of laughter and the hilarity and the hysteria that breaks through. Then the bell goes at 4 o'clock. Through our third person omniscience, we start to get a look at the lives of the teachers in their private lives. We then shift back after a couple of those stanzas, giving us an insight into private lives, to the school assembly the following day. However, what we start to gradually see, which I'm going to point out to you here now, is the hysteria and the hilarity and the rebelliousness of the pupils starts to spread across to the teachers, who, as you know, leave the school in droves. They resign and go and have a life outside of that. But structurally, that starts to occur from stanza 11 onwards, and I want to point you towards some quotes here to show that gradual increase. So we've had the snowball, which starts from a very small piece of snow and gains momentum and size and magnitude. Similarly, this rebelliousness is also passed on to not all of the teachers. There's Dr. Bream, who remains immune from that and ends up in a hospital, bless her, but a lot of the younger teachers. So, for example, let's have a little look here. So it's the morning after the first day of hilarity. There's an assembly on, and of course the girls start to giggle and cackle, and control is lost. So there's another example of that structuring we mentioned, of attempts to repress, not working and giving way to hysteria again. Miss Dunn and Miss Batt and Miss Nedimbamba and Mrs. Mackay leapt to their feet as one. There's that sort of solidarity as teachers at this stage, but of course they fragment, break away and resign. Grim-faced. The fifth form hooted and howled. Please see the language video on the Beano language. Miss Fife, now this is the key bit here, Miss Fife, oddly disturbed, crashed down fistfuls of furious notes on the yellowing keys. So I like the adjective there, yellowing keys, sort of symbolic of the decay of the institution. However, if you look just before that, when we've gone to the private lives of the teachers, we were told about how Miss Fife went to Miss Batt's house to play on her piano. We are told they are good friends, to use the sort of euphemism. which would be needed at that time to hide the fact that they were lovers or had strong desire towards each other. And we're told Miss Fife plays on Miss Bat's small piano. Now, the next time we hear a mention of piano after that, structurally, what follows on from that is more of this hysteria from the girls. In an attempt to gain control, I guess Miss Fife is hammering on the piano to get them to be quiet, but please look at oddly disturbed. This is a key point in the poem, I think, in terms of where the stirrings of this rebelliousness is starting to be shown amongst the female teaching staff. A handy little simile there in terms of rebelliousness, even though we're not doing language. I just can't help myself with language. Really sorry about that. The clouds was being slowly torn up like a rule book. More in the way of the seeds of rebelliousness here within the teachers. So there's the snowball, which, there was wet play and that caused hysteria. If you've ever had a snow day in school, you can recall your poor beleaguered teachers trying to keep control of you as students when you've been playing in the snow. There's just no chance of that. So the pupils have been rolling the snowball outside. Miss Dunn drumming the world's highest mountains into their heads. There's more on that style of teaching in the language video. Please check that out. A daydream of ellipsis there. Miss Dunn flung open her window. Ideas of escape and breaching the confines of the institution, and breathed in the passionate cold of the snow. A wild thought seeded, flowering imagery again, itself in her head. So, as you know of the poem, what this leads to, so there's no need for me to spoil the plot because you've read the poem, but there's that structure, pattern continuing again of the rebelliousness, or the seeds of rebellion, being sort of grown and sown in the female teachers. Structurally, the setting shifts again back to the flat, I think it is, of Miss Bat and Miss Fife coming around again for another visit. I talk about the symbolism of the corkscrew in the language video, but in a way, this is this sort of escalating structure now. So teachers themselves have been restrained and repressed by the demands of the school and their public sphere identities in the private sphere. Their desires are uncorked here. So we see that full breakout of passion here between the two female teachers. And of course, later on in the poem, this leads to "we're leaving." And the destruction of that institution and the ideology and all it stands for. Okay, so some analysis on patterning there in terms of structures, sequence and patterns, slowly charting the stirring of rebellion amongst the female teachers. We'll look at a few more slides to see how that fully escalates. First one here, yet another instance of the staff trying to repress and restrain the pupils. This is Dr. Bream, the head of the school now. Poor unfortunate Nigella Dawn. Again, a bit of aptonymic irony there. The dawn or the emergence of this. Hysteria and feminism. She was fished out by the head from her seat and made to stand on a chair on the stage. If you look a little bit later on, the head thinks she's won. That, she thought, in a phrase of her mother's, very old and archaic, has put the tin lid on that. Actually, it hasn't. That little moment there where Nigella Dawn is put on the chair on a stage. If you know the novel Jane Eyre, you can recall such similar mistreatment and cruelty of poor Jane Eyre when she's at Lowood. I think there's a deliberate allusion or nod to that there from Caroline Duffy. Interestingly, this action from Dr. Bream seems to have had some success, silencing and quietening the girls. However, something changes here again. Miss Bat flung her head back and laughed like a bride. So Miss Bat is the first one to, I don't suppose crack is the right word, but to show dissent and to show rebelliousness. Again, structurally, I think now she's accepted her identity, and she and Miss Fife have been intimate together. I think it's a devil-may-care attitude now. So to hell with your public persona and the expectations of this school. I'm going to show dissent and laugh at the ridiculousness of this. So it's not just the pupils who embody that school's out for summer, it is also, eventually, structurally, the staff. Another member of staff here who has the effects of this hysteria and liberation and rebelliousness is Miss Nadim Bamba, who of course ends up being a poet. Again, so there's maybe some autobiographical components in here. She held in her hands the poem which had made her a scribbler of verse at 12 or 13. The song, She Was Sick of the Laughter at Stafford Girls' High. She stared at the girls in her class who were starting to shake. Now previously this would have led to an attempt to reprimand them or silence them. Instead we have this. An epidemic, that's what it was. It had gone on all term. It was now the air that they breathed. Teachers and girls. Okay, so there's an important moment there where it's no longer a them and us. Or if it is a them and us, it's the us of everyone laughing versus the Dr. Bream head of the school. More Beano language, a giggling, sniggering, gurgling, snickering atmosphere, a laughing gas that seeped. It's everywhere. So there's no escape from it now. So teacher rebelliousness. The peak of this structural pattern, I guess, is reached in this stanza here, where there's Dr. Bream getting all kind of concerned and the pupils are learning nothing, the discipline's completely gone to pot. And then she puts all her staff in the spotlight. So there's no show of solidarity anymore. Poor Mrs. Mackay, there's a sign of her deteriorating sanity. Her response to that is to sing It Was a Lover and His Lass by Shakespeare. We also get a silence fell. Miss Bat looked at Miss Fife and cleared her throat. So more sort of throat imagery, finding their voice, the throat as being sort of a metonym for voice. We see that with Geraldine Ruth in the language video. And as cool as you like, Miss Fife and I are leaving at the end of term. Miss Dunn at the window turned. I'm leaving them myself to have a crack at Everest. And then we get this lovely moment where one by one the staff resigned to publish poetry, to live in Spain, to form a tennis club, to run a restaurant in Nice, to tread the boards, to sing in smoky clubs, to translate Ovid into current speech, to study homeopathy. Dr. Bream was white with shock. And then there's the concerns of business. What about the girls? Miss Bat, slowly undressing Fifi in the stockroom in her head, winked at Miss Fife. So the final things here. She giggled. This adverb is all important. Girlishly. Like a regained youth, sort of reanimated and rediscovered her joy again. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce this last name. Maybe it's deliberately and mischievously hinting at fever. But the way it's written could also be pronounced feather as well. But I'm kind of tempted by fever, given the laughing gas sort of idea that Miss Nadim Bamba was exploring before. So there's the conclusion, if you like, or the pinnacle of that structural pattern of how that spirit of rebelliousness has spread throughout the female teachers. In a way, you could argue, from or caught from the hysteria of the pupils. Our final slide here, so 5 of 5. I've missed out the entire middle of the poem and just put alongside each other the opening and the final 2 stanzas. I want to do that in terms of a mock epic and just to reinforce the idea that from something trivial, from something as small as a note, which contained a joke, which we're never going to hear and has never been found historically. Maybe it's going to take some sort of time team archaeological dig to find the note that closed the school, and how it has led to these massive changes and these sort of earthquake repercussions. So here's what a note did to the institution that was the Stafford Girls' High. So you see lots of death language associated here. Here it is, the institution as it will be forevermore now, gone, on a graveyard, a memorial to what was gone before. So very quickly here, just to look at the consequences, the life-changing outcomes from just that note and just some laughter, the supposedly trivial element in this mock epic poem. So the different fates of the different teachers here. Miss Nadimbamba's career as a poet seems to take off. Slight ominous note that she would open some wine. Perhaps that's a little hint at sort of alcoholism to cope with that. There's Dr. Bream, the nurse bringing warm milk and a pill to the head. Little pun on head. But obviously not well in terms of her mental state if a pill for the head is required. She's staring through the bars to a prisoner. Even though she's sort of spatially away from it, she's condemned to look at what's left, the blackened hulk of the school. The tragic fate of Mrs. Mackay here as well, finally run out of land. I've qualified that a little bit in previous parts of the video, saying it's not an entirely tragic end. It clearly is tragic. This poor woman takes her own life. But it's curious and it's interesting to look at the language used by Caroline Duffy here. It's almost like a form of liberation. She danced away like a groom with a bride. So you recall her awful marriage. And she writes her maiden name with a stick in the sand, not her married name. So in a way, she almost gets her identity back a little bit before she takes the awful step of walking into the sea and never coming back out. And of course, we have Miss V. Dunn and Diana Kim, the student who climbs Everest with her. They laughed. Okay, like schoolgirls. So we're seeing that youth again. And they fall through the clouds with a girl in her arms. Again, this is obviously death, but it seems to be a sort of paradoxical thing of a welcome or a happy death, even though it's the end of their life. Okay, so there's our video on form and structure in Caroline Duffy's poem. Hopefully you've already accessed and listened to the contexts video. By now you should be ready to progress on to the language video, which is a long video, but it is a long poem, and it goes into that level of detail that I hope to give you, which makes a massive difference in terms of boosting your grades. Add your likes, subscribe to the channel, leave some helpful comments underneath, that would be most welcome. On we go.